is Lisa Morgan, and I'm a speech and language therapist by background. Started off many years ago in community clinics, very much under the wing of health visitors and indeed school nurses to guide me through. And I currently work as a professional director for the Communication Trust. Apologies, your handouts have printed out really peculiarly, so I'm not quite sure how that's happened, but hopefully this will be easier to follow. The Communication Trust is a coalition of around 50 not-for-profit organisations, all of whom have communication very much part of their work. So some very big organisations there and some teeny tiny ones kind of out of somebody's kitchen, but all of whom have a focus on children's speech, language and communication. And the idea behind the Communication Trust is that if we work collectively, then our voice will be heard more loudly and more clearly than it would be if we all were chattering on by ourselves. And that's the kind of general gist of that. Okay, and we are in fact on a mission. It's our mission to ensure that every child and young person is enabled to develop the speech, language and communication skills that they need to have. And that we do that in working in partnership to build the skills, knowledge and confidence of anybody who works with children and young people. Really delighted to be able to talk today because we've set off a little bit later. It might be a bit whistle stop, so if I'm going too fast, kind of do shout. Okay, I'm going to talk briefly, let's go backwards, I'm just going to talk briefly about three things. The importance of speech, language and communication skills, a little bit about how they develop, a little bit about typical communication development, a little bit is the kind of order of the day. I'm going to mention some of the impacts of children who have speech, language and communication needs, and I'm going to give you a little bit of information about recognising speech, language and communication needs, plus there's lots of signposting to information that's available from ourselves or our partner organisations. Okay, there is tons of evidence about how important speech, language and communication are as foundation skills for other areas of children's development. Okay, they are that bedrock on which children learn, they develop their literacy skills, their social emotional behaviour. So essentially they really are those really crucial building blocks for other areas of children's language development. And I've just kind of put one or two bits of interesting kind of evidence on there that if you look at a child's language development at the age of 2, you get a really good sense of how good they'll be when they start school at 5. Okay, actually at 22 months, you can predict children's outcomes when they're 26 if you look at their language. Okay, it is massive, okay, which is why there is a really clear focus around supporting children's speech, language and communication early on. The other really interesting thing, particularly for those of you who are working in areas of social disadvantage, that the size of a child's vocabulary aged 5 is the best predictor of how likely a child is to buck the trend of social deprivation. Okay, I'll talk a little bit more about how associated speech, language and communication needs are with social deprivation, but actually children who have strong vocabularies are able to buck the trend at from the size of their vocabulary when they're 5. That's a really strong predictor of how well they'll do. Okay, and the impacts around children's difficulties with communication are huge. Okay, there's just one example there that children with limited communication skills are 6 times more likely to develop reading difficulties. Okay, so that sense of early language development is really crucial. The other thing, I do quite a lot of work with people right across the ages, so not just kind of from that kind of early perspective. So not only are they the building blocks that need to be there to start off with, to build learning on and to build social development on, they're also part of everything pretty much that children are going to be doing as they grow and develop into young people and then adults. So they are very much a feature of all of those elements that you can see on the screen. Without speech, language and communication, thinking's really tricky. Okay, learning is difficult, there are issues in terms of behaviour. All of these areas are really well evidenced. Okay, so that there is research which shows the centrality of language along the way. But partly because communication is so important, sometimes it's easier to take it a little bit for granted, again, certainly some of the work that we do with the school workforce is that because it's so important, it's just implicit. And one of the roles of the Communication Trust is about making it really explicit, because if we don't get these skills right for children, then evidence shows that they're not going to catch up. Is this making sense so far? Okay. So the impacts for children who do not develop their speech, language and communication skills effectively are many and varied. There are some examples there, and these again are all based in evidence. So evidence shows that children with communication needs have less well-developed self-esteem generally. Okay, they're actually at more risk of being bullied. The links between communication skills and behaviour are really, really strong. Between 60 and 90% of young offenders actually have undetected communication needs. 60 to 90. Okay, that's a really common figure that lots and lots of studies routinely show. And the point at which these guys' communication needs are spotted is actually when they happen to be part of a study looking at that kind of thing. Okay. That focus on learning, on literacy, confidence, all of that is really, really well evidenced. And if you are interested in finding out some more of the research behind that, there's a series of papers called I Can Talk papers from an partner organisation called ICANN, which looks very much about the evidence base about these sorts of things. Probably the one that I'd recommend most is The Cost to the Nation, which really pulls out what the impacts of children's poor communication development is across all of those different areas. Okay, this is really whistle stop. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about how children develop speech, language and communication skills. Would I be right in assuming that this sort of child development work is part of your initial training in CPD, or not? Yeah, everybody? No, okay, for some people, okay. So for some it's a bit of a refresher, for some it's perhaps a little bit new. And this is really kind of top line stuff that I'm going to kind of whiz through. I'm sure you're all really aware that those speech, language and communication skills are developing right from birth. Okay, so that your little chap or your little lassie's popping out, and that's the point at which they are communicating with the world. Actually, there's some interesting research about how they're developing their skills before they pop out, but it is that kind of really, really strong right from birth feature. Now that's important because certainly anecdotally, we have lots of stories where parents and indeed some early years professionals some kind of great Ofsted quotes around, okay, so you're working in a baby room, what do you do to support the children's communication? Or we don't do much of that because they don't talk to us back. Okay, just anecdotal information and absolutely not the norm, but there is still a long way for us to go in really reinforcing that those relationships and attachment right from the word go are all the things that need to be in place to really support the little folks' communication development right at the beginning. The point that I just want to kind of draw out from that is that those skills need to be fostered in the same way for a baby all the way through adolescence. Okay, communication development doesn't stop. It's something that we need to continue to pay attention to nurture and develop along the way, right the way through adolescence and into adulthood. It's not just an early years thing. It's not just a baby thing. It goes all the way through. Again, probably preaching to the converted, that speech, language, communication skills develop through interacting with other people. They don't. I can have a bit of an issue with when people talk about children acquiring language skills. They don't really acquire them. Somebody shows them what to do. Somebody responds to what they're doing. It's not a passive process. It's a really active process involving people responding with them. I'm just going to mention a little tiny bit of research which focuses on some of the roles of parents and the communication environment in supporting language development. So a big cohort study in Avon, the Avon longitudinal study, which looked at lots of areas of children's development. But the language section of that, this is where the statistics around children at 2 comes from. But children's communication environment influences language development really strongly. Okay, which kind of makes sense. Some of the factors that they pulled out were how many books a child has available to them, how many times they go to the library, the activities, the range of activities that parents teach them and do with them, and the number of toys. They're all really strong predictors. But what I think is more interesting is that the communication environment is a stronger predictor than social background. Okay, so the links between speech, language and communication needs and social disadvantage are really, really massively strong, but it's what a mum does with their child. It's the amount of support, confidence and sense of well-being that she has, and the physical resources she has available to her, which makes the difference, not how much money she's got. Okay, so it's not who she is, it's what she does that makes the biggest difference. Does that kind of make sense? I've sort of rattled through that really quickly, but I can easily find you a reference for that in a bit more detail. So what mum did, had and felt in the first 2 years was shown to be important on children's performance at 5. Okay, so obviously in your role of working and supporting with parents, particularly around that kind of development of parental skill, but also for parents to feel good about what they're doing and to feel confident in the best ways to support their children's communication development. And then the final little segment is that speech, language and communication all follow typical patterns. There are really clear ages and stages, there are really clear patterns of development, that this happens, then this happens, then this happens. So there's a really clear set of guidelines for us as professionals to work out who's on track and actually who's not, to enable us to then do something about it. Okay, I'm aware I'm going really, really quickly. Do kind of shout if there's anything that's not clear along the way. So I kind of put this in as a little bit of a test, but we probably don't have masses of, not test, a little bit of fun, masses of time to do this. And actually you've got the answers in your pack. But this is taken from some learning that we provide around looking at, so what's typical for a 2-year-old? And there are lots of different ideas there about what might be typical for a 2-year-old. Some of them aren't. Some of them are completely. So feel free to have a little look and maybe mentally make a note of which ones do you think are typical for a 2-year-old. And then we'll have kind of have a little look. I'd really hope to be able to kind of discuss this a little bit more, but I know you're kind of finding out about jabs in a bit, so I kind of can't get in the way of that. Okay, so this is what's typical for a 2-year-old. There we go. So your typical 2-year-old should use 50 or more single words, ask lots of questions, understand between 200 and 500 words, understands a question like, where's Teddy? And makes short sentences of 2 to 3 words. Is any of that surprising? No? Is this part of your kind of stuff that you're really secure with already? Fantastic, that's great. Okay, I'm working really hard with some schools to embed this into their thinking a little bit more, because it's certainly not part of initial teacher training to have that sense of development, and that's really, really crucial, because what tends to happen, particularly in areas of social deprivation, is where people are less secure about knowing the ages and stages, their expectations shift. So the child who suddenly seems amazing is actually bang on average. Okay, and that's really hard to mitigate against. I'll tell you a little bit more about something we did around that. Yeah. Okay, so Nick had brought some resources that were outside earlier on, and I'm just going to kind of bring them to your attention particularly. 2011 was a National Year of Communication, the Hello campaign, which we had the pleasure of delivering, and as part of that we developed these booklets which go from 0 to 5, 5 to 11 and 11 to 18, and they set out those ages and stages really clearly. I didn't write them, so I can say they are really great, and they also give some suggestions about how to test out where children are on track or not, and then what you might need to do next. Okay, they are free to download and they are free to order. Okay, so feel free to have a little look, but they're kind of there to really just put it all in one place around children's ages and stages of language development. Okay. Okay, so there we go. Okay, so we're going to really, really briefly touch on what speech, language and communication needs are. There are lots and lots of different descriptions and definitions. There are lots and lots of different labels. This is the terminology which all of our organisations who work with us have agreed. Okay, so that most children follow that expected pattern of development at the expected times. Some children don't. Those children are described as having speech, language and communication needs. So that we manage to get away from saying, well, it's children who do this or it's children who have that, but actually we know what children are expected to do. Where children are not, they're described as having speech, language and communication needs. Does that all make sense? Our sector is really troubled by the kind of range of terms used and how complex that can be, but that's our kind of, I guess, that's starting to be our sector agreed definition. Okay. There are lots of different reasons why children may have speech, language and communication needs. There are some children where we don't know the reason at all. Okay, but that covers all of those different groups of children. There are some children whose needs are very much part of something else, like autism or hearing impairment, and there are some children where speech, language and communication is their main and primary need. Some facts and stats, just to wet your whistles on this one. 10% of children and young people will have long-term persistent speech, language and communication needs, either as what's called a specific language impairment. So that is where everything else around their development is great, okay? Cognitively, they are as able as everybody else, but there is something around how they develop speech, language and communication that is massively and specifically tricky. And they may be described as having speech language impairment. And then speech language communication needs as part of something else, like autism, hearing impairment, learning difficulties. So that makes up that 10% of guys who have long-term persistent SLCN. 1% of all children have very severe and complex SLCN. Many more children have delayed speech, language and communication skills. In areas of social disadvantage, routinely where there are studies that look at this, as many as, and in fact upwards of 50% of children have delayed language that is not associated with cognitive delay. Okay, does that kind of make sense? Okay, it's a figure that comes up time and time again, that where at any point during a child's education, around 50% of those children are likely to have speech, language and communication delay. Would that sort of tie in with perhaps some of the areas that you're working in, do you think? The really important thing is, without appropriate support, those kids don't catch up. Okay, they might get a little bit better, their skills might improve, but they don't catch up. Okay, so in terms of from the school perspective, speech, language and communication needs is the most common special educational need that primary schools identify. So of all the children that they identify as having a special educational need, communication needs are the most popular, if that makes sense. But it is still hugely under-identified. 7% of children are likely to have specific language impairment. Only 3% of those children are ever identified. So there's a huge issue around under-identification. We've just done a really big project in Manchester, and we looked at, it was a whole big community-wide approach called Talk of the Town, looking at embedding communication within a whole community area. And we're working with some great schools, and we asked them to identify any children in early years, primary or secondary, who they thought had a speech, language and communication need. These are good and outstanding schools, and they missed between 30 and 50% of those children. Okay, partly because that whole expectation shift has happened. Okay, and they missed some children who were a year behind when they were 4, a year and a half behind when they were 4. Huge gaps along the way. So one of the things that we're really focusing on is how can we support people who are working with children and young people in recognising when they may have speech, language and communication needs. The first point is very much about saying, what would we expect a typical 2-year-old to do? What would we expect a typical 6-year-old to do? Okay, and having that really good understanding of ages and stages. We don't expect you to keep it all in your heads. Certainly, I did my training quite a long time ago, and I quite often have to look things up now. But there are lots and lots of resources which kind of set that out very explicitly. Then recognising children is based on looking at them, spending time with them, listening to what they have to say, and recording that. Not in a massive kind of scary way, but just noting down what it is they are struggling with and what it is they can do. Parental reporting only is not a well-evidenced way of identifying children's needs from a communication point of view. It does identify some of them, but it's not seen as an effective way of identifying children's communication needs. Parental report only. The other thing is that where children are having difficulties in other areas of their development, so if they are having difficulties with play, if they are having difficulties with social relationships, then perhaps communication might be part of that. I have nearly finished. Obviously, gaining the views of children and parents is really important. That use of tools and resources, there's lots and lots out there to help you, which I can signpost you to, and then sharing the concerns with families, with other professionals that you might have about children and young people. Okay, so I'm just going to post you to a few. If you go on our website, which I think is at the end of your presentation anyway, all of these things will be signposted from there. Oh, it's not? Okay, I can give you that in a second. Okay, so universally speaking, I've mentioned those, they're free to order or download from the Communication Trust along the way. I'm going to signpost you to the Talking Point website, which is a kind of a collaborative website which has lots and lots of information about communication development and communication needs. It also has a little progress checker that you can say, this child is X number of months, and it'll then ask you some questions about to guide you in terms of what they might be doing. ICANN, I've mentioned already, is a children's communication charity. They have lots of information and resources available. I'm going to signpost you to something called the SLCF, where and it outlines the skills and knowledge that people who work with children should really have about communication development and about communication needs. You can fill in an online audit, get a little overview of how confident you feel, and then be signposted to further information and training as required. And then I'm finally going to mention really, really quickly, we're just talking with Ethel about developing some webinars for Thinking Thursdays around exactly what I've talked about in 20 minutes over a slightly longer period of time. So if you're interested in finding out more about this topic, then obviously look at those tools and resources, but then maybe also look out for Thinking Thursdays, and we'll give a bit more information. And then that's our website, thecommunicationtrust.org.uk. And if you have any questions or queries, then we have an inquiries section. So please do feel free to get in touch. I'm really sorry for eating into the next session, and thank you very much for your time and listening to me today.